This is a complicated text. It's a hard text, and it's based in some things that are very sad. The words that we just read here. We ended with some sad words, where he has gone through now and spoken to the scribes and the Pharisees, and has gone through and talked to them about their failures, and he's pronounced these woes. But there was a phrase there that is important for everything we're going to talk about today as we go into 24 and then set up for what we'll talk about next week. He said, so that on you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the earth. That's what this section is about. It is about the vindication or the vengeance of God. And he says it's from Abel in Genesis all the way to Zechariah at the end of Chronicles. If you were thinking about for us, it's like Genesis to Malachi, the beginning to the end. Every single one of them is going to be held on that particular generation. Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. The city will be left desolate. And why is it? It's not because God doesn't want them to come. It's because, as he said down there in verse 37, they were unwilling. Now, I want you to put yourself in this situation. Can you imagine being among the scribes and Pharisees when they heard this? Can you imagine Jesus saying these things to you? Because oftentimes we have things kind of said like this to us. And in fact, this is recorded for us to come back and to look at and to think about and to ponder. But like so often happens, what do people do with Jesus' words? They ignore it. And eventually, these people did not believe that it would happen, and yet Jesus has said, God is coming through. He's taking the vineyard from Israel. He's going to give it to fruit, to people who will bear its fruits. And those things did happen. Those things did come about, despite the fact that they may not have believed it. See, what you have right here is a picture. I don't know if y'all probably seen this picture before. This is from the Arch of Titus. In about 40 years from these prophecies, in that generation, like Jesus predicted, the city was destroyed by Titus. That's why there was an arch made. And an estimated 1 million people died. People that would have been among this crowd that had heard it. And in fact, the picture here, my background that we'll have kind of going through the lesson, shows the riches taken from the temple. And do you notice what this is right here? That's the menorah. That was from the holy place. That was from inside the temple itself. And they constructed the Arch of Titus. And in fact, there was such enormous wealth taken from this temple that it paid for the construction of the Colosseum. There's a whole lot more we could talk about that story. And in fact, it was Jewish slaves that did a lot of the work in building that place. You know, we look at this marvelous work of architecture, and there's something to that. We need to remember that what this is saying is that what God said comes true. What God predicted, what Jesus said here, was true. Now we might ask then, why is this happening? Why is God doing this? Why is such a harsh and awful fate for these people? Well, here's the first obvious concept we've been talking about. How should you respond to a righteous person that comes to you and warns you and wants you to repent? First off, you've got to obviously believe their message, but do you see what he was saying they were going to do to the righteous people? He said that they would kill them, they would crucify them, and they would scourge them and persecute them. So obviously that's part of the problem. That's part of the reason God is going to do this. But further, and secondly, if you remember, go back to Deuteronomy chapter 28 with me for just a minute. It is that God made a covenant with Israel. And you see this in Leviticus chapter 26. You see it also in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Both of these are times where he's going through and reminding them of the covenant that God made with Israel. But here in this section, God is saying, okay, I'm going to speak to you, and if you continue to harden yourselves, I'm going to keep speaking, and you're going to harden yourselves, and it's just like a ratcheting up, and things get worse and worse and worse as God is trying to bring his people to repentance. And then here in verse 45, look at what he says. So all these curses shall come on you and pursue you and overtake you until you are destroyed, because you would not obey the Lord your God by keeping his commandments and his statutes which he commanded you. They shall become a sign and a wonder on you and your descendants forever, because you did not serve the Lord your God with joy and a glad heart for the abundance of all things. Therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord will send against you, in hunger, in thirst, in nakedness, and in the lack of all things. And he will put an iron yoke on your neck until he has destroyed you. The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the ends of the earth, as the eagle swoops down, a nation whose language you shall not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, who will have no respect for the old, nor show favor to the young. Moreover, it shall eat the offspring of your herd, and the produce of your ground, until you are destroyed, who also leaves you no grain, new wine, or oil, nor the increase of your herd, or the young of your flock, until they have caused you to perish. It shall besiege you in all your towns until your high and fortified walls, in which you trusted, come down throughout your land, and it shall besiege you in all your towns throughout your land, which the Lord your God has given you. And let me just say, that is the cliff notes of this section. There are some parts of this that are staggering and bothersome even to read out loud. You need to, as an adult, go back and read Leviticus chapter 26. Read Deuteronomy chapter 28. But the point is, he had made a covenant, and he promised that if they persisted in disobedience, the city would be destroyed, the land and the city itself will be left desolate. Now, if we look at this story, though, we might say, well, this has happened before, hasn't it? It happened before in the days of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, but notice what he's saying. It is going to come on a full degree with that particular generation. And then what you have here is actually some interesting symbolism as well. In the days of Ezekiel, who was the protector of Israel? It was God. It was His presence in that temple that made it holy, that made it safe. And in Ezekiel's day, there's a picture of where the glory of the Lord leaves and goes to the Mount of Olives, and then the army sweeps in. And now, where is Jesus when He gives these words? He's been in the temple. He's driven from it, and now He goes out to the Mount of Olives, and the protection is gone. The city is now going to become desolate. Now, with all that being said, if you had heard the kind of words that Jesus had just said, you might ask one fundamental question. When? When is this going to happen? When is all of this going to come about? And that's what these questions are. Notice here in chapter 24, in verse 3, they say, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now notice, they don't deny it, but they're obviously curious. And in their mind, it seems like these things go together. Because in the Jewish mind, they're thinking about the ultimate return of God. That would include the destruction of the temple. It would be the bringing in of the Messiah, all of these kinds of things. And that's why I think their question here in verse 3 kind of puts all of these things together. There's a couple of questions here. And yet what Jesus is going to do is He's going to give them, just like He does a lot of times, He's going to give them more than they anticipated. More information than is just involved in the question. Because it's more complicated, isn't it? Yes, He's going to go through and help them understand the time as it relates to the destruction of Jerusalem. But He's also going to give them some things like, what about His ultimate return? What about His coming and the end of the age? And then how are we supposed to live in between that? And so I'm going to give you, this is arbitrary, and probably no one's going to agree with my divisions of this text, because everybody has a different view on this. But I believe here verses 4 down through 44 are talking about what's going to happen toward Jerusalem. In verses 45 of 24 through chapter 25 and 30 are three parables that he gives of what the kingdom of heaven is going to be like after, obviously, there's this transition in this period until Jesus ultimately comes back. And then in 25, 31 through 46, we have the ultimate end, when Jesus comes in His glory and all the angels with Him. So what we're going to talk about today is the first part of that, and we'll talk about the next two parts, Lord willing, next week. So what I want us to do is basically pretty simple, is to just read the text, walk through it, And let's see the things that Jesus is referring to. And we'll go through the 3 sections here, and then we'll see what are the applications. What am I supposed to be doing as I'm listening to and thinking about these things? And so let's begin here in verse 4. We're going to go down through verse 14. Now, before we do that, I want you to imagine you're there. I want you to sit at Jesus' feet. I want you to be one of the disciples for a minute. I want you to imagine that you're sitting there, you've asked this question, and you've never heard the answer before. And just think, what is he describing? What is he talking about? Imagine being a disciple and then hearing what he describes. So let's begin here in verse 4. And Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But these things are merely the beginning of birth pains. Then they will deliver you to tribulation, and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." So a time is coming when there are going to be disciples that will be misled. There's war, there's nations that are rising up against one another. There's famines and those kind of things. And as you can see, what he's describing is an exceptional time of tribulation and of difficulty that he's talking about, where even as a disciple, as he's speaking to them, remember, I want you in those positions of the disciples. Look at what he said about them. They would be delivered over. They would be killed. They would be hated. Even some of their own family would betray them. And so you have these kinds of pictures here of what ultimately is going to happen. Now, a lot of this should sound familiar. If you continue reading the rest of the story and you read the book of Acts, what do you see? You see these same types of pictures in the treatment of the apostles and the treatment of the disciples. There's famines. In chapter 12 and verses 1 and 2, James is killed. There were false messiahs. There's various other pictures, and you have the same picture of the gospel going forth into all the nations. And there's going to be war and difficulty, but the main point here is there has to be endurance. You've got to endure. Things are going to be very, very difficult, and you have to do those things in order to be saved. But notice one of the things that he said. He's describing some things that obviously are about to happen to them, but he has an interesting phrase here. At the end of verse 6, he says, "But that is not yet the end." In fact, there's 3 different times where he mentions things about the end. And so what we have a picture then is there's some things that have to take place. There's some things that have to come about, but that's not yet the end. Again, he's kind of stretching their mindset, helping them to understand it's more than just it's going to happen right at this moment. There's some necessary pieces that have to go forward. So there's prophecies. There's events that have to be accomplished. And he says something very important. There in verse, let me see if I can find it. In verse 8, notice what he says, "But all these things are merely the beginning of the birth pains." Now, what are birth pains? What does that have to do with anything that he's talking about? Well, I've said this before, and it's really, really important in this text. Pretty much anytime you come to a phrase or a line in this text and you don't know what it is, it's because he's referring to something in the Old Testament. I've said that before, just keep that in mind. Now, the reason for that is, what he's talking about is things back in Isaiah, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But before we do that, let's talk about the analogy. What is Jesus saying when he says it's the beginning of birth pains? Well, a lot of us, I guess at least the ladies, the men have, obviously had wives that were pregnant and that kind of thing, but they understand what birth pains mean. Birth pains mean that a baby is coming, don't they? But does it mean that the baby is coming right at that moment? No, it's not that. And in fact, when you have a mother, when they have the first birth pain, it's just a, hey, okay, this is a process. There's things that are coming. But are the birth pains necessary? Absolutely. They're necessary in the process of birth. Now, what are these events? What is he talking about? He says that there is a birth in the future. That's why you have the birth pains, right? Well, what did Isaiah talk about? Again, I felt like when I studied through this, studied hours, there were so many different things that I wanted to talk to you about, but I just don't have the time to reference anything. Not everything. I have some time for anything, not everything. But in Isaiah 26 and Isaiah 66, when he talks about the resurrection, when he talks about the end of sin and death and the culmination when Christ returns, he uses this image. And in fact, hold your finger here, turn to Romans chapter 8 for a minute. In Romans chapter 8. In Romans chapter 8, here verses 18 through 23. Notice he talks about the sufferings of this present time. And there was a lot of difficulty, particularly, that Paul had been through. But he says here in verse 18, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God." Now notice here in verse 22. "For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. And not only this, but we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies." This is the culmination. This is the resurrection. This is Jesus' return. It's the end of sin and death. And so what is he saying? This is the beginning of that process. There is a change. There is a transition period that ultimately will culminate when Jesus returns. And so what he's describing here is, despite the difficulty, there's hope. That this is obviously a very difficult time, but there is a hope of Jesus' return in the future and him coming and making all things new like he promised. And so go back now to Matthew chapter 24. With all that in sight, he's trying to help them understand the difficulties they're about to have, set their perspective to the future, and then he gives them down there in verses 12 through 14 some descriptions of how they're supposed to live in this upside-down world. He says things like, don't let your love grow cold. He says things like, make sure that you endure. And he says things like preaching the gospel. We'll talk about those a little bit later in our application. But we're looking to this future perspective, and they're going to be in very dark times. But he's wanting them to live in a special way during that time as an example to the nations. Now, with that being said, let's continue reading in Matthew 24. And we're going to look this time now at verses 15 down through verse 28. He says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures, or eagles, will gather. Okay, so we worked through this next section, and I want us to kind of step through it, but I want us to begin with what he says is important for us to understand. He says there in verse 15 that Daniel spoke about this, and he wants you and me to understand. But in order for us to understand what's happening at this moment, we need to understand something that happened in the Old Testament. So hold your finger here and let's go back to Daniel chapter 9 for just a minute. In Daniel chapter 9, this is an important text because it's 70 years or so after the initial first destruction of Jerusalem. Daniel was there, and he's looking through the documents, and he sees, okay, it's about that time, and they're about to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. And as a result of this, he's praying and repenting for Israel's sin, just like Solomon said he should, and just like Jeremiah said that he should. But the response is here in verses 24 through 27. This response is important because Gabriel comes and gives him more information about what's going to happen in the future. And so he says now in verse 24, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Now he's talking about the city after the destruction of Babylon. It's going to be rebuilt. In verse 26, then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the Prince who is to come, notice, will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Now, if that seems a little confusing, Daniel was a little confused after that section too. But he's talking about the Messiah coming. He's talking about Jesus dying for sin, but he's also talking about the Prince bringing those people to destroy the city and the sanctuary. And he mentions there the abomination of desolation. Now, what is he talking about? He's saying that God has decreed that Rome is going to destroy Jerusalem, and as part of that, the sacrificial system is going to stop. And it's going to participate along with the Jews in killing the Messiah. And all of these things have to take place. Remember, we haven't finished Matthew yet, but he's telling them about what's about to happen in the next few days and then ultimately in the next few years. And just as you look at this section, another part of this, which I think is important, again, here's your extra references you can look at. Zechariah talks about these same things in chapters 10 through 12 and basically just elaborates and explains these same types of pictures. And he's quoted in our sections that we'll see going on in Jesus' life. But our second stop in Daniel is in chapter 12 now. In chapter 12, what you have in 11 and 12 are further explanation of these events that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem and of the end of the Jewish people as God's covenant people. Now notice here in verses 1 through 13. It says, now at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time your people, everyone who is found in the book, will be rescued. Many of those who sleep in the dust will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But as for you, Daniel, Conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others were standing, one on this bank of the river and the other on that bank of the river. And one said to the man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the river, How long will it be until the end of these wonders? I heard the man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the rivers, as he raised his right hand and his left toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. As for me, I heard, but could not understand. So I said, My Lord, what will be the outcome of these events? He said, Go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end time. Many will be purged, purified, and refined, but the wicked will act wickedly. And none of the wicked will understand, but those who have insight will understand. From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days. But as for you, go your way to the end. Then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. What is he describing? He's describing exactly what Jesus is talking about. An extraordinary time of suffering and persecution, and ultimately the shattering of the holy people and a purification of Israel. So all of these pieces are fit together, but notice verse 13. There is this time period of the end, and then there's this ultimate one where he is raised at the end. Now what is he talking about then? Go to Luke chapter 21 for a moment then. In Luke chapter 21, what is the abomination of desolation? And this is important because our culture they've got all sorts of ideas and all sorts of different ways about what this is, and yet look at what Luke says it is. When he quotes Jesus, he says in verse 21, But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. It was Rome. It was Rome coming through and judging Israel as a tool of God. It's the army approaching. Now let's go back to Matthew. In Matthew 24. All of these things then make sense, don't they? As you have a nation coming up, leading people into captivity, judging them for their sin, there's distress and difficulty. Everything that Zechariah and Daniel have talked about is happening. Notice what he says then to do in verse 16. If you're in Judea, flee to the mountains. It's not flee to the walled cities. It's flee to the mountains. Get away. And then you have things like the pregnant and the nursing and praying that it's not on the Sabbath or in winter. All of that is about getting away physically. And that is, in fact, one of the things that is most important here. A lot of times people will say, these are signs of when Jesus comes back. I'll say this, fleeing physically is not going to help you when Jesus comes back. Fleeing physically did help you whenever the Romans came. And that's what Jesus is trying to help. That's what Jesus is trying to do here. As well, down here in verse 21, again, here's this enormous tribulation. It's unlike anything that has ever been seen. What's he talking about? It's that God is leaving the Israelites. The nation's being destroyed along with the temple, never to be rebuilt. Have you ever really thought about that? We've been longer without the temple than the temple was ever in existence for the people of Israel. It's been a long time. There's been no sacrifices. There was a complete change of things. And when did that happen? It happened here. And it's unlike anything that had ever happened before and anything that had ever happened after. But as we continue through Matthew 24, down in verse 22, we see that God is in control of all of this. The elect, those that are faithful, God will take care of them, but even they have to be aware of these false Christs that can come in and ultimately cause problems. But notice as well, he says in verse 26, or in verse 27, when Jesus comes, it's not going to be a secret thing. It's not going to be something that's hidden. There wasn't going to be any secret appearances or secret raptures. It is like lightning flashing across the sky. He's giving them pictures of here's the destruction of Jerusalem, and in a sense, comparing it with his ultimate return. And then notice what he says down in verse 28. I will say this is a personal thing, but Most of your versions will probably say vultures. I think they missed the point here. It's supposed to be eagles, and for a reason. Because in verse 28, he says, wherever the corpse is, there the eagles will gather. What Jesus is making a reference to is Deuteronomy 28. He said that he would bring in a nation like an eagle. And further in Ezekiel 17, he described Babylon as an eagle when he came in and he destroyed Jerusalem. What will happen, what has happened in the past, is going to happen again. Now, with that being said, he's giving them pictures again to understand this isn't the complete end, but there are some things that are about to happen. And now let's look at this next one. Here are verses 29 through verses 44. Because he describes some things that are going to happen immediately after the tribulation of those days. So now in verse 29. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. And the stars will fall from the sky and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, notice this phrase, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be two men in the field, one will be taken, and one will be left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, and one will be left. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour when you do not think he will. All right. It doesn't get a whole lot easier, but there's a lot more things here to walk through. So Jesus describes the events that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem, and then he talks about the very specific day. So there's tribulation that leads over a period of time, and then an ultimate collapse and destruction. But notice what he does here in verse 29. He makes a reference. He talks about the sun being darkened and the moon not giving its light and the stars falling from the sky. Now, I love this about my Bible, but you may not have it there. He's actually quoting from the Old Testament there. So turn with me now to Isaiah chapter 13. In Isaiah chapter 13, now here verses 9 down through verse 13. To begin, look at verse 1 here. This is an oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah saw. And he talks about the destruction of that city and also the nation. And so now in verse 9 it says, Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel with fury and burning anger, to make the land a desolation. And he will exterminate its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. Thus I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their impurity. I will also put an end to the arrogance of the proud, and abase the haughtiness of the ruthless. I will make mortal men scarcer than pure gold, and mankind than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken from its place, at the fury of the Lord of hosts, in the day of his burning anger. Now, when we read in Matthew 24, we think this is the destruction of the world. But he's quoting from Isaiah. And what is he saying? He's saying it's the end of a city. It's the destruction of a city. And so he's making the nation desolate, and he's taking this language and says, hey, you've read this about what happened to Babylon. That's going to happen to Jerusalem. But this does require a little bit of explanation about how the prophets work. See, when the prophets look at a local event like the destruction of a city, they use this cosmic language, the earth being destroyed, the stars falling, and those kind of things. And why is that? It's because this is a present example of what ultimately is going to happen in the future. It's the end of their world. It's a picture of what ultimately is going to happen in the future. So you have this now in the sense of a specific place, but it's an example of what God is going to do with all people there at the end. Now, let's go back to Matthew chapter 24. In 24, he talks about as well the sign of the Son of Man causing all the tribes of the earth to mourn, and the Son of Man coming on the clouds. Now, what is he talking about there? Well, in Zechariah chapter 12, he talks about whenever the Son of Man will be lifted up, that all the tribes of Israel were going to mourn. They're thinking, I believe, about his death, about his resurrection, about what they have done, and now he's coming and judging them. And further, when he talks about the Son of Man coming on the clouds, here's more of Daniel, right? But it's a picture of the Son of Man that they tried to kill that has now been enthroned and is ruling and reigning over all the nations. Because if you look back there in Daniel 7, that's what that time period was. It was the Roman Empire crushing not only the Jews, but warring with the saints. And yet ultimately the picture is of victory. And yet he also says here in verse 31 that there will be a sending forth of his angels and a great trumpet and a gathering there. I'll tell you this is probably one of the hardest ones here. But one, it could have been happening there within the first century. The word angels there is just the word messengers and sending the message out and calling them by the gospel. Or he may be referencing the end, again connected with those people that are ultimately obeying the gospel. Because Jesus describes something very similar there in Matthew chapter 13. But here's the point that I want you to see. He's tying in the local judgment of Jerusalem, the local judgment of that place with what's ultimately going to happen to these people forever. And so as you look down here a little bit farther in verse 32, he says that these are signs. These are parables of the fig tree, or this is the parable of the fig tree. These are signs to where they could look and see, this is about to happen. And again, double underline right there in verse 34. It was going to happen in that generation. So what's the point then? The specific day was unclear, but just like in the days of Noah, those people thought, hey, everything's fine, everything's going great, and then they were swept away. And one more thing about that, have you ever heard this in verses 40 and 41, that there's going to be a silent rapture, which we've already talked about isn't accurate, and that the righteous are going to be taken away. That's actually not what this text is saying. It's saying that the wicked are taken away. Notice in verse 39, it was the flood that took them away. It's the wicked that are taken out. And so what Jesus then is giving, just this overall picture, is right here at 42 through 44. They're not going to know the specific day, and if they had, they would have prepared for it. But they weren't. And so the judgment came, and these people were ultimately swept away. And the thing is, everything that Jesus predicted was true. That's what we started with the very first slide. I forgot that I didn't have it in the other parts. But everything Jesus said. Vespasian comes later. Galilee is invaded. They surround the city in 67, and for about 3 years, the entire city was basically just starved out. In 70, in April, Titus began to breach the walls, and by September, Jerusalem fell. Everything that he predicted came about. And so that's why Jesus is saying, let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Don't flee to the walled cities. Flee away so that you can be saved. And it was a judgment on that generation. Now, there's a whole lot more we'll talk about next time regarding these parables and also the ultimate judgment scene and that kind of thing. But I will say this, you're probably listening and you're thinking, man, I don't agree with that. I think this part's this, and I think this part's this. And y'all have the good job of just sitting and listening for like 30, 40 minutes, and you don't have to try to get up here and explain all of this. But that being said, I will say, I'm not sure that I even agree with myself all the time. I looked at some of this today and I'm like, I think that's where the division is. But the challenge with this text is that a lot of the language is used interchangeably, isn't it? When he uses the end, what are we talking about? When he uses the coming of the Son of Man, what is he talking about? See, these are things that can be used in a local sense, or they can be used ultimately at the end. But the point is, they're both actions of God. And both of us ultimately are going to face these kinds of things. And so these parables and the judgment are strikingly relevant. It's not just something that we should read and think, oh, well, they should have listened to God, and they didn't think God was going to keep His word. What happens to us? We fall into the exact same trap. We think we would be so much better than them. And yet, the thing that made the difference was if they truly believed Jesus' word, and they believed Him and obeyed Him. Now, with that being said, how should we live? How should we live? I asked you at the beginning of this lesson to put yourself in that situation. Can you imagine what it would have been like to sit there as the disciples and hear that come out of Jesus' mouth? I mean, that would have been extremely complicated. A lot of things there that He's referencing, probably more complicated than just about anything He has taught to this point. But what did it mean for them? How were they supposed to live now? And that's the point for us. How do we live with these kind of things in front of us? Because when we listen to that, it doesn't sound like, hey, it's going to be sunshine and roses and we're going to ride off into the sunset, guys. It doesn't sound like that. It sounds like things are going to be very, very challenging. And so he gives three things that I think are important for us to look at quickly before we end of how to live in troubled times, just in general, but even troubled times where, let's say it was the city of Chattanooga that was destroyed. See, these principles are true regardless of the time period, and they regardless of the difficulty level. So go back here to verses 12 through 14 of Matthew 24. The first thing he said is, don't let your love grow cold. See, imagine living in a world they described, a time of famine and war and intense tribulation. Imagine friends of yours being killed. Imagine that you are hated by all people because you're a Christian. And some of even you or other people have been betrayed, and now they're either in prison or killed. The truth is that kind of thing could happen here. It happens in many places in the world. And further, imagine Christians falling away, betraying one another, hating one another. False prophets have now come and are leading many people away. And when you look out at the city, it's lawlessness. Policemen don't want to go out there. The policemen are corrupt. The government's corrupt. Everything is just in confusion. See, in light of the small things that we saw during the pandemic, we can see how quickly our lives can change. And we need to realize that these things are not only possible, and many times if we persist in sin, they become inevitable. But look at what he says. He's saying, here's how we can face the dark days. It starts with not letting your love grow cold. See, if you go back and you look through human history, some of the worst and most difficult times that human history has ever gone through, what's one of the first things that happens to people? If you go to the concentration camps during World War II, you go into any kind of suffering throughout the world, what's one of the first things that happens to people? Is they lose their humanity because they lost their love for one another. The love grows cold. And what is he talking about? He's saying this passion for God, this passion for the Word, the passion for other people, that becomes very cold and stale. And this is what we have to be on guard about. We have to watch our hearts and our minds and keep on loving God and loving people, especially in those difficult times. Because usually what happens is, according to our natural instincts, we think, I got to do whatever I've got to do to survive, and we forget God, we forget one another, and then it just becomes a cycle. It just gets worse and worse. But even when they're persecuting us, even when people are falling away, even when there's false teaching and lawlessness, the answer is little simple things. It's loving God. It's loving your neighbor. But that begs the question then, how is your love? How is your love? Has your love already grown cold? Are you as passionate for God now as when you first believed? Because the trials, ultimately, they don't cause new things. All they do is reveal the things that are already there. And when Jesus spoke to the church in Ephesus in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 4, He's preparing them for difficulties like this that are about to come. And what was the thing that was so wrong with that church? It was that they had left their first love. They didn't love God anymore. They didn't love God. They didn't love one another like they should. And so we have to ask, are we really loving one another? Do we truly love God? Is our passion still there? It's hard. I'm not saying that the world is not in a difficult place. It definitely is. One of the first things that we have to be very careful about is not to give up our love for God and love for one another. Now notice here in verse 13 what he says. He says we have to endure to the end, and this is connected because it's very easy to get in difficult times and endure for a little while or even for a long while. I've been doing this for years and then just give up. But notice what Jesus says. He doesn't say you get credit if you endure for a little while or you get credit because you endure for a long time. You have to endure till the end in order to be saved. And so that begs the question, are you faithful to Jesus? Are you committed to following Jesus till the end? Because what Jesus wants is people who take the message of the cross seriously. And yet the truth is there are many people who will take up the cross for a while. They'll walk for a while, but then when it becomes difficult, they put the cross down. And there are many people who at one time were willing to give up their lives in order to save them, but their hearts change. There are many who at one time thought it was profitable, more profitable, to give up the world in order to save their lives. But they don't think so now. And so what Jesus is saying here is He doesn't want us just to follow for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. See, in order for us to be saved, we have to endure to the end. But He gives us the resources for that. He gives us the resources to be devoted to Him, trusting in Him, this hope, all of these various things. But ultimately, we have to decide to be committed to Him. And then the last one here in verse 14. In verse 14, it is to preach the gospel as a testimony to the nations. At this point, I think it's a good thing for us to remind ourselves of what the gospel meant. The first, I guess the primary place this idea is used is in Isaiah chapter 52. And it's the idea that your God reigns. And if you go back to Isaiah 52, that was when Jerusalem had been destroyed. And there was no strength, there was no power, they had no real hope except for God. Everything looked hopeless. And yet the thing that could give them hope, even in the midst of desolation, was this fact: your God reigns. And so, despite the circumstances and despite the failures of all the people around them, Jesus was still king. And what He wants them to do is share that message with other people. The city's destroyed, the land's destroyed, you think everything's gone. No. The good news still needs to be preached. Because isn't that what it is? It's good news. And in dark and difficult days, what do you want to hear? You want good news. And so the gospel then is like a light shining into a place full of darkness. And so Jesus explains to us how that works. Because He obviously dies, but could they stop Him? Could Rome and Israel ultimately stop Him? He died, He was raised, and He defeated the power of death, and He's ruling and reigning now. And that's not going to change. It goes on forever and ever. Because ultimately, that's a message then not only about who runs the world, but it's a message for us as well of how we can be forgiven of our sins. We can be freed. And then we can go through events like this where even if we die, what happens? We get to go and be with the Lord? It's a total difference that is important to understand in the gospel. And further, as I said earlier, the good news is about the end, isn't it? Because there will be a day in the future when all wrongs are made right. The birth, in a sense, that we are waiting for will come. God will have His day of justice, and all those people that have done evil in the world will be held accountable. But here's the thing that I think happens. We hear it. We hear it over and over and over. We get in the difficult places and we just think, oh, okay, I need something new, or I need to hear, a different picture of this. Brethren, He's given us everything we need. Once we understand these truths, what it does, it changes all of this. When you understand who's on the throne and you love Him and you appreciate Him, ultimately it warms our hearts and fills us with new love for Him and also for one another. It also gives us the power to endure, to understand, yes, things are out of control right now, and I don't understand who's got all of these things and their power and the destruction that they're bringing in, but I know at the end, God will take care of things. And then further, it draws us into this work of proclaiming the good news. Because if you go out in the world, do they have news for these kind of events? I mean, how to live your best life now, or how to win friends and influence people. It doesn't do very much when you come to the destruction of Jerusalem. But the good news does. And so whenever these things are put on our heart, we will then have the power to take up our cross and live like Jesus did all the way till the end. And then just like Him, because of our faithfulness, we will be crowned victorious and inherit the kingdom. And so what we now have the opportunity to do is to come to the table and to think about this upside-down gospel that is a message of love. It's a message of endurance. It's a message that shows God's power and victory, that ultimately by partaking in this feast, we can become more like Him and have these truths become more committed to us. And so let's pray. Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day and all You give to us. Father, we look at these words and they make us uncomfortable. They upset us because oftentimes we are so proud and we hold on to our sin and we reject Your messengers and we turn away from You. Father, help us to have hearts that will turn and be changed by Your great love for us. When we see what You have done in the gospel, of Your love for us and Your power and Your desire for us to be saved. Father, help us to come to the table today, to have our love renewed and rekindled, to have our endurance strengthened and encouraged, and then to be motivated by the truths of the gospel to go forth and share that with others. Help us in this church to be people that are changed, to be the kind of people that You want, even in these times of difficulty. In Your Son's precious name, amen.